Perfection consists in doing God's will and being content what He wills us to be. Can you be content with how God has made you and all of your limitations, and that you often don't have what it takes to fulfill your lifelong dream? Very simple, but to live that out is extremely painful.
Praise be Jesus Christ, and welcome to another episode of Carmelcast. Carmelcast is a production of the Institute of Carmelite Studies Publications. For more information, you can visit our website at icspublications.org. And we're back here for the last episode of this season. I'm very glad to be joined by Father Mark Foley, again, our publisher here at ICS Publications. And really what we're doing is we're wrapping up this entire season on Saint Thérèse, which is kind of marking her relics being here in the United States. I think at the time of this airing, she'll be down south preparing to go to Wisconsin, and then she's going to be coming out here to the East Coast. So make sure you visit the relics of Thérèse if she's coming to a place near you. I'll put a link in the description so you can find the locations there, the schedule of her visits. So we're marking in this season, really, then we're marking her visit, a visit of her relics, but also this is marking a larger period of time. 2023 was the 150th anniversary of Thérèse's birth, and then this year, 2025, marks the 100th anniversary of her canonization. So we're kind of marking all these events with this season. And so due to popular acclaim, Father Mark is back with us. A favorite here on our channel. So thank you, Father Mark, for being back and sharing your wisdom with us.
He browbeated me to be here, so just,
That's true, that's
okay.
true. Well, I wanted to talk about this episode kind of to end these discussions on Thérèse. I wanted to talk some about maybe the, misconceptions or preconceptions or stereotypes that people have about Saint Thérèse. Sure. And just kind of go through some of those. I don't know, maybe we'll affirm some of them and say that the stereotypes are right. In other ways, maybe we can nuance some of those preconceptions. And so I just wanted to start with, as a first one, I imagine, this was my own experience reading Thérèse the first time, and I imagine it might be the experience of other people too. I was a college seminarian, and I read Thérèse for the first time. And honestly, like, everyone loved Thérèse, everyone talked about Thérèse, and honestly, it kind of turned me off a little bit. I think a lot of that is it seemed perhaps like overly sentimental, or girly, flowery, like that language came across as kind of an obstacle to me. And so that's what I maybe wanted to start with and see your thoughts on that aspect of Thérèse's writing.
Yeah, I had the same experience. I had never heard of Thérèse before I entered the order. And when I was introduced to her, I think I said this in another podcast, I couldn't read her without taking an insulin shot for 10 years. She was so sugary. But what I found, and you asked me this question about language, flowery language, what I've come to is one of the real problems, and I think this is a real problem with Thérèse, even if you have no problem with her flowery, sugary language, is her overuse of diminutives, little, tiny. She calls herself a little flower, a little bird, a little grain of sand. And the reason I say that's a problem is diminutives can obscure and lessen the significance of really what is being said. Often we hear her language and we say to ourselves, oh, that's very, very sweet. And we can miss the power of the message. And we ask ourselves why. And I've come to this, not just with Thérèse, but just reading in general, that the emotions that the language of a text evokes within us becomes the lens, it becomes the primary interpretive tool through which we read the text. So we feel something, and we read it through our emotions. And I think the real task of reading Thérèse is getting below the flowery, sweet imagery in order to get beyond our initial reaction. Because once we can get beyond our initial reaction, it really opens up to us a depth of spirituality that's very rare in any of the saints, you know.
Right. And like you said, I mean, people might have two emotional reactions to reading
Yeah.
Therese's language. One, like me, maybe it's kind of a turn off or an obstacle that prevents you from really getting to the depth of her
Yeah.
message. On the other side, there could be people who like this language,
Yeah.
but because of maybe they read it in a more shallow sort of
That's
way,
right.
or they miss that there's so much more depth because they're still stuck on perhaps the surface level of the
That's
language.
right, yeah. And I, you know, when you asked me this question about the language, the first thing I went to was the opening image of Thérèse, and that's the image of the garden, which is a beautiful, beautiful image. But if we really plumb the depths, we can see that it touches major areas of our lives. Let me just read this opening image.
And this is at the very beginning of Stories.
Yeah,
Story of a
I'm
Soul,
sorry.
correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. She says, I wondered for a long time why God has preferences, why all souls, excuse me, don't receive an equal amount of graces. Why did God will to create great souls comparable to lilies and roses, but he created smaller ones comparable to daisies and violets? That's a nice, beautiful image. And I think that we can misinterpret these words as meaning, Thérèse does not mean that we are not created equal because we're all made in the image and likeness of God. However, I think what she's saying, and she was very much aware of this, is that in regards to both supernatural grace and natural qualities, which we really compare ourselves with, we are not created equal. That's nonsense. Some people are naturally more intelligent than others. Some people are more physically attractive, and some people are more gifted. And there are some souls that God gives wisdom and spiritual insights to which he does not give to others. And when we compare these gifts that God gives us to those he has not given us, to those who he has given, we can erroneously conclude that God loves other people more than he loves us. Thérèse really addresses this in chapter 11 of Story of a Soul. She says that there are people who do not receive God's wisdom and insights often become fearful because they believe that they are less loved by God. This is what she writes. When they see a soul more enlightened than others, immediately they conclude that Jesus loves them less. And this fear becomes infected by envy, because envy is both comparative and competitive by nature. Thérèse goes on, she says, at times one casts a look of envy upon a person possessing so many things. Getting back to the image of the garden, underneath the image, we're really dealing with something that we're all involved in, comparing ourselves with others. Some people are like lilies and roses, and some are like daisies and violets. Lilies and roses are flowers that are looked at and considered more beautiful and more valuable than daisies and violets. What we are dealing with here, I think, is how people value other people. And the flip side is we're afraid that other people, what they will think of us. And I think this is a real problem.
So what I mean, kind of what we're getting at in this image, it seems to me, is, I mean, Thérèse is communicating a profound spiritual insight,
Yeah.
and maybe one that's perhaps kind of hard to receive.
Yeah, very, very hard.
And she's doing it in a language, though, that's
right.
soft or flowery. So there's actually a real genius to this. Like
That's
the
right.
idea of the viewing the different flowers is much easier way to look at it, especially maybe in our egalitarian society.
Exactly.
We don't want to accept the fact that, like, oh, maybe I'm not as smart as that person, or
Yeah.
maybe I'm not as spiritually gifted as that person is.
That's right. Let me give you an example in my own life. When I was in my 20s and 30s, my ego ideal, my persona was I wanted to become a full professor. I mean, I even got a tweed jacket with little patches on and smoked a pipe, and I kind of inculcated this image. And about 20 years ago, I thought I got an opening for this. I was asked to teach some courses in Carmelite spirituality at Washington Theological Union. I was an adjunct. I mean, I taught one course a semester, very, very minimum work. And I found that very difficult, and it became evident to me in a while why I would never become a professor. And it was very, very evident. I didn't have the brains. It was that much. I mean, I'm not stupid, but I didn't have the brains, the type of intelligence that it would take, and to accept that, because we have dreams for our lives, and they can become nightmares. In the midlife literature, they speak about the tyranny of the dream. We feel that we have to actualize this image of ourselves, and the dream you have for yourself, maybe you got to really mourn. You don't have the brains. You don't have the physical stamina. I mean, if you're 5'4" and weigh 400 pounds, and your dream is to become the best pole vaulter, it probably won't work.
Yes.
It probably won't work. You got to really give that up. Now, Thérèse says something else right after the image of the garden of what perfection is. Sounds beautiful, but get below the surface. Perfection consists in doing God's will and being content what he wills us to be. Can you be content with how God has made you and all of your limitations, and that you often don't have what it takes to fulfill your lifelong dream? That's very, very difficult to accept. Perfection consists in doing God's will. And what's doing God's will? It's being content with what God wills you to be. Very simple, but to live that out is extremely painful,
Yeah, so if you're a wildflower or a dandelion even, then to be content and not try to be something that you're not, that God's not created you to be.
That's right. Yeah.
And to accept your own gifts and beauty in the midst of the difference that's there.
And, and these dreams can be tyrannical. I mean, we get them from our society. We can get them from our families. Carl Jung once said that one of the real dangers in children one of the greatest dangers in children is the unlived life of their parents. That the dreams of their parents can be visited upon their children, and the children want to be loved and accepted, so they begin to follow somebody else's dream, and it just doesn't work out.
Yeah.
And they can follow for 30, 40 years and wake up one day and say, what have I done with my life? Mm-hmm. So really accepting, can I be content with the person God has made me to be in all of my giftedness, but in all of my limitations? Mm. So, you look at this, quote, flowery image and really get below the surface, and she's dealing with things that we all deal with in our lives.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so essential, like you said, to be able to get down to the substance of what she's saying, because you start Story of a Soul and you read all this language and you're like, I don't usually think of myself as a any type of flower.
That's right.
I have allergies. I don't really like flowers that much. So like Therese's language there, I think can be a turnoff to some people.
Yeah.
I also wonder, some of this is just French, like the kind of diminutive language,
Yeah.
and perhaps
Yeah.
especially the French at her time
That's right.
is
Yeah.
to just like call everything my little my little so and so,
That's right.
like all these pet names and. So I think that Thérèse, this is like a product of her culture, her
Oh, yeah.
language, her
Yeah.
time period.
Exactly,
And so
yeah.
we have to do the work, perhaps sometimes as readers
Yeah.
not overlooking it, but like getting beyond it to
You
the
have, you, have,
substance.
you have to translate it. I mean, I think you're right. I think it was Bishop Guy Gaucher in his biography of Thérèse said that the language of 19th century France really betrayed her. You know, I mean, you pick up cues of language of the people around you, and that was the language that was used, and it's not the way we speak. It's not the way I speak.
Yeah.
You know, so I think you have to. But my takeaway on this is it's an exercise of reading. Really pay attention to the emotional responses that any reading does, because that is the primary hermeneutic of reading the text, and we read through our emotions.
And that can be an aid at times to understanding a text.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
But it can also prevent us from truly understanding them. I mean, we do this. I don't know about you. I do this all the time. Sometimes I get an email
Yeah.
or a text message, and you read the tone, you interpret it
yeah.
based on the tone that you
Yeah.
think the person has,
Yeah.
and you can totally misunderstand what the person's actually saying.
Exactly.
Because you think maybe they're angry at you or they're frustrated with you, and I read that into a message, and
Exactly.
it's not actually there.
Exactly. And the opposite can be true too. One of the things they taught us when I was getting my master's in psychology at Loyola was if there's a contradiction between the content and the tone, interpret the tone. So how you interpret the tone, just be aware of the tone, because it really interprets, or you can misinterpret what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just would like to say, the people out there, reading is hard work. It really takes. That's why I'm a very, very slow reader. I try to get through a page and I go through it and I underline it and I go back and I'm trying to figure out what's being said, and don't presuppose you know what a text is saying. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of it depends too on translations.
Oh yeah. Definitely,
And this is
yeah.
where, I mean, I think our ICS translation of Thérèse is actually very good.
Yeah.
There are translations of Thérèse's Story of a Soul that read more
Yeah.
flowery or sentimental.
Yeah.
Whereas I think that like Father John Clark did a fairly good job of making sure that the substance
Yeah.
of Thérèse's message gets through.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. I think this will kind of then can lead into another sort of preconception or stereotype of Thérèse. If we're going to summarize that first one, it's like, well, was Thérèse sentimental or flowery language? And it's like, yes, on the surface, that is
Yeah,
true.
that's right.
But it's the substance of her message is
That's
so
right.
much deeper than that.
That's right. Exactly.
So then connected with that, though, is another sort of stereotype. And it's funny because this was, again, my reaction reading Thérèse. You start Story of a Soul, you get those flowery images. The next thing you get are these stories of her childhood.
Yeah.
And she just, I don't know, she comes across as at times like spoiled,
Yeah.
at times as though she had no struggles in her life. She was just, I don't know, like things were going too well for her.
Yeah, that's right.
And so I found it hard to relate to at times. And
Yeah.
those, especially these are like the beginning of manuscript A of Story of a Soul, can be really difficult, I think, in
Yeah.
that regard.
Yeah, yeah. You asked me that about Thérèse being spoiled, and I said, I don't think she was spoiled or pampered, and the reason I say that is, with spoiled children, there's a sense of entitlement. I don't see any entitlement. However, I would say in her family circle, she was overprotected, and for good reasons, because of her emotional fragility and the change of her personality because of her mother's death. And that was necessary, but it came at a cost. And Thérèse was very mature in this. she had the maturity to accept the negative effects of her childhood. She says, for example, I really don't know how I could entertain the thought of entering Carmel when I was still in the swaddling clothes of a child. She realized she was still somewhat emotionally immature. She accepted it. And it wasn't easy for her. I mean, let me give you one image that people might think is cute or sweet. Mm. Considering the abandonment issues of Thérèse, being, taken away from Zélie at an early age, the death of Zélie, Pauline going into Carmel, she found that very, very difficult to be away from mother images. And in Story of a Soul, she's in Carmel, and she says, I had to, and she's talking to the prioress, I had to run by your room and hold on to the banister so as not to go back and to get some, I don't know the word she used, probably like emotional refueling. Now, people say, oh, that's sweet that she mortified herself. But what that image says to me is, one, the depth of her anxiety and the strength of her will. She was really holding on.
Right. So you're saying, just to clarify this, so she was walking by the door of the prioress.
That's right.
It's like she wanted to go back to say something to the prioress or to ask a question to the prioress. And she was kind of mortifying herself. And she explains that to prevent herself from going back there, she would actually like grip tightly onto the banister.
That's right.
To keep where she was instead of going back. Yeah. It's just, I think it can be easy to maybe even laugh at that, but I mean, that's just our life. I think at times, I remember when I first came into Carmel, it's like, how often do we reach out on our phones, for example? It's like as a means of seeking consolation.
That's right.
And we have to learn to mortify that. Or maybe people turn to social media or turn to something else as a sort of to medicate. And what Thérèse is doing there is she's, like you said, through the strength of her will, is she's turning away from that kind of, a pacifier in a sense, in order to choose to be more mature.
And it was, and she realized the danger of staying a child. She says in Story of a Soul, for the first 5 years in Carmel, I did not make known my sufferings, especially to my sisters, because if she did, she's being reunited with the two people that mothered her in her youth, Pauline and Marie. Mm-hmm. And she says, what if I had become the pet of the community? Mm-hmm. And she realized that she could have regressed to being a child. Toward the end of Story of a Soul, she says, now that I've really mortified myself at the beginning, now I don't feel the necessity of refusing all human consolation. This was somebody who knew that I've got this mother wound, and I cling to mother figures, and I've got to really be careful of this, and I got to break this. Translate that in your own life. When you're really anxious, you want to call somebody up, you want to hold on to them. We all have abandonment issues to one degree or another. Thérèse had a big time.
Yeah. Or you want to turn to the cell phone.
That's right.
Or social media.
Exactly.
Or whatever it might be to kind of numb that that pain.
And I think another aspect of Thérèse's maturity in this is she neither blamed anyone, it was my parents' fault, nor did she use her childhood wounds as an excuse, not to do anything about it. Thérèse was, this is one of the paradoxes of, in my mind, of Saint Thérèse. She had childhood wounds that the emotions were very, very difficult to deal with, and she was she had an incredible amount of ego strength. In the face of anxiety, she was willing to bear it for growth and for the love of God.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And connected to that is it's always helpful when I'm reading Story of a Soul to remember how old Thérèse is at the time when she's talking about certain things. Because, again, she was 15 when she entered Carmel. So, I mean, take a 15-year-old girl today and put them in that, in religious life. I think sometimes you can read things that seem immature, but if you forget what age she is.
That's right.
Or like you said, forget perhaps what wounds she has from her past, then we can judge them differently.
Yeah, they happened in the past, but they were still present. And,
Yeah. Well, and maybe we can turn then to something, I mean, very much connected to this is like that Thérèse's life wasn't all sunshine and roses. She had a lot of sufferings in her life.
Yeah.
And again, if you don't, I mean, I don't think, if you actually read Story of a Soul, you're going to see so much of that because she talks about it. But I think maybe people who haven't read Story of a Soul, they just think of, oh, Thérèse is this nice saint with flowers that throws down roses on us all. And but her life and her spirituality is actually one that involves much more.
A lot of suffering.
Yeah.
I think in past podcasts we've dealt with the physical suffering of her tuberculosis. We've also dealt with the emotional, psychological suffering of the dark night, her scrupulosity, and I don't want to rehash that. But the suffering that I think I'd like to focus on is the suffering that is the result of transformation and purification that came out of the little way, which we talked about last time, and I like to look at one aspect. And I think the best place to begin is with Thérèse's definition of perfection again. Mm-hmm. Perfection consists in doing God's will and being content with what He wills us to be. Being perfect is doing God's will, which will consist in being the person God wants us to be, not who the world and the people around you want you to be, or what they expect you to be, or they need you to be for them, or to fit in the mold of their ideas of what perfection consists. And if you do this, that is, being the person God wills you to be, you're going to disappoint a lot of people. People will think that you're selfish, I could give examples of that out of Thérèse's life. And people will think that you're spiritually a mediocre person. And there are people in her convent that thought she was spiritually mediocre. And that comes out of living the little way. Now, I think what's important here is to put this in perspective, that when Thérèse entered the monastery, the spirituality of the community lent itself to the nuns judging one another in regards to extraordinary acts of penance. And let me read a passage from Abbé André Combes. He was the first person who had access to the complete archives of Lisieux Carmel. He writes, "The apostolic doctrine of the French Carmel is contained fully in the notion by which a Carmelite nun is put in the place of a sinner, acting as a substitute. By her very calling, the Carmelite nun is a victim offered to God in order to offset the obstinacy of the sinner, to appease the justice of God by willingly accepting the punishments due to sinners." Now, this next part I think is very, very important in regards to the divergence of Thérèse's little way from the spirituality of the community. When this plan was taken literally, the fidelity of the nun to her calling was judged according to the intensity of her spiritual and bodily mortifications. The cross of iron and the whip of nettles were then held in high esteem and honor. It was thought that thus might necessary sacrifices be offered to the justice of God and merit piled up for those who worked for the upbuilding of God's kingdom. Let me just say something about the cross of iron. Okay, the cross of iron was a metal cross with very sharp prongs on one side, which the nuns would actually put on their bare chest and cover it over, and it would cause bleeding. And these things were held in high honor. These are the things they compare themselves with. And what we hold in high honor are the areas in which we seek fame and the admiration of others. Thérèse could not compete. Pauline writes, Thérèse told me how she wore her little iron cross for a long time and it made her sick, and that it wasn't God's will for her. So she's realizing the will of God for me, my path is not the path of the community. So I'm going to live here, so what is going to be my path? That was the question that Thérèse had. Well, one day she went in to visit Mother Genevieve, a very old saintly nun, and Thérèse realized, as she writes the story of his soul, I met a saint, one who was made holy by the practice of the hidden virtues, the ordinary virtues. And it's precisely because Thérèse's little way could not be held in high honor that she was convinced of its authenticity. She writes, that type of sanctity seems the truest and most holy to me, and it's this type that I desire because in it one meets with no deceptions. And the deceptions I think Thérèse is referring to are the deceptions of pride. In fact, she says to Céline regarding these extraordinary penances, quote, self-love finds at times great satisfaction in these excessive mortifications. And the motive often lurking underneath these practices can be seeking recognition from others. In fact, John of the Cross writes something very similar. He says, their works and virtues become vices because they want others to recognize their spirit and their devotion. So at the core of Thérèse's little way was the practice of the ordinary, the hidden virtues. And in fact, Thérèse was so successful at this that on her deathbed, she heard one nun said, we never see her practicing virtue. In fact, she could hardly be called even a good religious, end quote. And I think this is what Thérèse wanted, that, it would really strip her ego of what other people thought. Now, I'm going to tell the audience a goal for your spiritual life, but I don't want you to misinterpret me. I would say live in such a way that when people look at you, they say, now there is a mediocre Catholic. There is a mediocre Christian. Okay. Now, I'm not saying be one, but live in such a way that when people look at you, that's what they think of you. You're just mediocre. Do you know how much ego suffering that entails? That's huge. I mean, that's one of the sufferings that really made Thérèse a saint, right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting too how because this goes to the fact that a lot of the nuns at that time period would make these offerings to God's justice. Yeah. Thérèse, part of her genius was that she was able to see that, like you said, that wasn't her way.
No,
that wasn't her path.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, even in that, she was. She wouldn't judge the path of another.
No.
And so she would say, like, this is a good thing, perhaps for them. She wouldn't put it down.
No.
And yet she would say, like, but my path is something different.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, she really, when she dealt with the novices, Céline said, she treated us according to the unique contours of our soul. She never pressed her way. And as Thérèse says in the autobiography, souls are as different as faces. You know, and she really respected the differences of people. So what my way to God is can be very much different than yours.
I'm reminded of how after Therese's death, when they were opening up the processes for her canonization, they come in, these clerics come in to interview different people in the community, and they were interviewing Celine about Therese's virtue, like because they have to go and they have to determine whether she had heroic virtue, whether Thérèse had heroic virtue, and like you said, some of the mentality of that time is that they were looking for this sort of extreme, whether it be penitential or whatever it might have been that they were looking for, and Celine was so insistent. You can read about it in her book, how Therese's was this way of like the little simple, the ordinary hidden virtues, and how even if that meant like that they wouldn't canonize her, like she wasn't going to change her story because she knew that was the way that Thérèse lived. So she wasn't going to make up these stories or over exaggerate certain things, but say no, it was really in her littleness and her hiddenness. Like that was where Therese's virtue.
And I would just like to underline how difficult the little way is in regards to the hidden way, the ordinary way. And it really gets down to the thing of envy. We want people to think of us in a certain way. I mean, you know, if you're... if you go to a gym, you compare yourself to other people's physique. You know, if you are into, I don't know, beauty or what have you, you compare yourself of how do you look within other people. Well, what happens when you're in a convent? What do you compare?
Holiness.
Holiness. And, well, we have to find out, well, how does holiness look? You know, the cross of iron was held in high honor. Well, how do I know that she's wearing a cross of honor? It's being manifested in some way. Is the person making it manifest? Are they going around? John of the Cross speaks about spiritual pride, that people give certain size and positions and what have you to manifest it. Do they go around, I mean, we want people to know that we're suffering, you know, because if you know I'm suffering, that means I'm really bearing a lot and I'm holy. Thérèse never gave that impression. She gave the impression that she had an easy life.
Yeah, and in that she fooled some of the nuns she lived with.
She certainly did.
It seems that there were those that knew her well who saw beneath, as far as like they saw that her holiness consisted in really in her ability to love.
That's right.
And that's where she excelled.
That's right. She didn't have to be the holiest person in the room. She could let somebody else be that. Yeah. And I think you make a good point. How do we know all this about Thérèse? Because she did have some intimates that she shared with. And all of us have people that I think we need to share what we're going through. That's healthy. But if you're trying to kind of be on stage and let the world know, that's another problem. Huh? No, but it depends upon your ego. I mean... being the professorial persona, you know, one of the hardest things I've struggled with, and I think I've made some progress in it, is I've always wanted to be the cleverest person in the room. You know, the person that would know everything. And but you get to a point where you're saying, give it up. The only way you can give it up is keep your mouth shut. Yeah. I remember, let me give you an example. I can't remember where I was. And there was a conversation we were talking about people being in an authority and how difficult it is. And somebody quoted that line from Shakespeare, heavy lies the head that wears a crown. And I bristled and saying, no, the real quote is, uneasy lies the head that wears. I needed to be one up on this. I didn't say it, but how difficult it was for me not to say it told me how deep that ego was, that I wanted to look that way.
Yes.
Really.
Right. Yeah. 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 It reminds me of the story that Thérèse talks about. I think it's in chapter 11 of Story of a Soul, how we so often misjudge the virtues of others as
That's right.
vices, and the vices of others as virtues. So she's,
Yeah.
I think she's at recreation with the sisters, and there's an opportunity to go help one of the
Yeah.
other sisters.
Yeah.
And Thérèse takes her time undoing her apron
Yeah.
in order so that one of her other sisters could have the
Yeah.
chance to go. And so then she's judged as being lazy, as though she didn't want to go help. But really, it was this act
Yeah.
of virtue that Thérèse was performing.
Actually, what she says is far more devastating. She says, it was evident to me that everyone in the community thought I acted out of selfishness.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're living with people, and you could have cleared it up, and people think you're selfish. Do you realize how much strength that takes?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. And it's in fact, there's a passage in Celine's book where she talks about judgment. And she says, take two sisters. She says, one sister is doing a little bit amount of work, and the other is doing a lot of work. But this sister, who is suffering from a migraine headache, is actually doing more by the little she's doing. But on the outside, we judge by appearances.
Yeah.
We don't have the slightest idea what people are going through.
Mm.
We really don't.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be dangerous when we start trying to judge virtues and vices of others. I remember when I was a novice, as you see this very often in I think in Catholic circles, where you go into the chapel and everyone sits in the back.
Yeah.
And part of that's like maybe some people just, I don't know, they don't want to be in the front. But other people, I think, can be a sense of false humility.
Yeah.
Of like, oh, I'm going to be very humble and sit in the back. Don't want to go sit in the front.
Yeah.
Well, I remember as a novice thinking like, it was mortifying to me, but I would just go and sit in the front row, even though I hated being
Yeah.
in the front row.
Yeah.
I hated having to like the idea of eyes on me, what was hardest for me about it was knowing that I might be judged by others as though I was being proud by wanting to sit in the front row.
That's
and
right.
That's the last thing I wanted. I just thought
Yeah.
it was ridiculous that everyone would sit in the back and no one would sit in the front.
That's right. Yeah, and we go through machinations in our mind over and over and over again. Yeah. Pride is mercurial by nature. It changes form as we wrestle with it. Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is good. I think, perhaps we didn't state it this way at the beginning, but one of the misconceptions about Saint Thérèse is that her little way is easy.
Yeah.
And I think what we're getting at here is like that the opposite is actually true. Her little way is, maybe a better way to say it is her little way is simple, but it's not easy. It's a very, very difficult thing to live.
There's a clarity to it, Thérèse said, I think it was in the last conversations, I love simplicity, I hate pretext. The opposite of simplicity for Thérèse wasn't complexity, it was duplicity. And she did not live a duplicitous life. And there's so much duplicity in our lives. And to work on that and to be that single-minded where there's no duplicity, that's really that's a lifetime purification, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, good. Well, I wanted to turn finally to one more. We had somewhat of a discussion about this maybe a couple of weeks ago, so I'm curious to see where this goes because it inspired me to talk about it on this episode. And this is to talk about this idea of like devotion to Thérèse can be at times like seem superstitious.
It can, yeah.
And so to talk about that reality, like, is this a misconception? To what truth is there to this? So, like, for example, what I'm thinking of most especially is the idea of people praying to receive a rose from Saint Thérèse during her novena as a sort of sign of certainty of some request that they're asking.
Yeah. This is a hard question to answer because, you have a spectrum of what that means for people out there, but it can be superstition. I put down some questions. What does it mean to ask for a rose? Do you base a decision on receiving it or not? What criteria do you use to differentiate coincidence from a sign? There's a passage in John of the Cross when in the Ascent, where he's speaking about the danger of being attached to spiritual goods. And part of the goods he's talking about are like discernment of spirits or interpretation of words. And he writes, the reason is that discernment of the true gifts from the false demand much counsel and much light from God, both of which are exceedingly hindered by esteeming and rejoicing in these works. In other words, desire darkens our judgment. If you really desire this rose, you can really be blinded, and our desires are often at the root of our beliefs. When I was thinking of this, a passage from it's Gorgias. It's a dialogue by Plato, and in this passage, there's a physician and a pastry chef, and they're trying to convince an audience what's the healthiest diet. So the physician says, eat vegetables, fruits, whole grains, things like that. The pastry chef says, no. You can eat pastry, ice cream, cookies, Big Macs, things like that. Okay? Now.
I didn't realize Plato wrote about Big Macs.
Oh, yeah. He did a lot. He was really, yeah. So, now, the audience to whom they are speaking are little children. Now, I want to ask you a question. You're a pretty bright guy. You may be able to answer this. Who do you think the little children are going to believe? The doctor that says, eat your vegetables, or the pastry chef that says, you can pig out on ice cream and cookies all day?
Yeah, they want their sweets.
That's right. And it's a funny thing, but I think what Plato is saying is we're all like children, and whether we want to believe this or not, what we believe is an expression of our desires. And are we aware of how much our desires shape our interpretation and perceptions? I don't want to cast aspersions on anyone who asks for a rose, because I don't know what that really means.
Well, and we know from Scripture, there are times that God does give signs.
Exactly.
We know that God does intervene in miraculous ways in
Exactly.
people's lives. But I will say it was a obstacle for me when I first started reading Thérèse.
Yeah.
Is you hear these people, it seemed superstitious to me, looking in from the outside, that people would go and ask for these signs from Saint Thérèse. And
Yeah.
I was a college student studying engineering, and I was like a little uncertain of this.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me is like that Thérèse herself never advocates for this practice in particular.
No.
She talks about how she is going to be, giving a shower of roses from heaven. And it seems to me like perhaps, again, not that we shouldn't ask for roses necessarily when we're praying in Ordovina to Saint Thérèse, but what seems more in line with her little way would be if we do ask for a sign or a rose or something like that, her little way would mean to have absolute confidence in God, even if we don't get
That's right.
the sign.
That's right. Because any prayer petition has to always end with "Thy will be done," and people can approach any text in a way like anything, like Jesus, anything you ask in my name will be given to you. And you ask in the name of Jesus, you don't receive it, and say, I don't understand it. Now, I found something in the autobiography of St. Teresa and the spiritual testimonies that may bear in on this. After she was cured of a serious illness, she writes, I began to recite devotional prayers that were highly approved, but never cared for other devotions, especially superstitious ones. Now, Teresa does not tell us what she meant by superstitious. However, she gives us a clue in what she says about her devotion to Saint Joseph, through whose intercession she was restored to health. She says, quote, I don't recall ever having petitioned Saint Joseph for anything that he failed to grant. And then she qualifies the statement. If the request is somewhat out of line, he rectifies it for my greater good. And in the spiritual testimony, she writes, I understood that I had a great obligation to serve Our Lady and St. Joseph, for often when I went off the path completely, God gave me salvation through their prayers. In short, Teresa did not see devotion as a quid pro quo. She did not expect to receive what she prayed for if it wasn't in line with God's will. I mean, we can approach novenas like, I put in 9 coins, pull the lever, and out comes the gift, It can get almost superstitious. But if you don't get what you're asking for, maybe that's a sign that you're asking for the wrong thing, or God doesn't want you to have it.
Or He wants you to wait.
Wants you to wait, or any other thing. But if you take it literally, I did my part. I prayed the novena. I asked for a rose, and you folks didn't come through. That can cause confusion. That can cause bitterness. That can cause unbelief. If your faith is based upon.
Well, and John of the Cross is so careful about. It's one thing to receive a sign; it's another thing to be able to interpret what that sign means.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the great example people often use is Saint Francis. He received the message to rebuild the church, and he thought they were talking about a physical building and a location, and it was actually meant in a more spiritual way, perhaps.
Exactly.
So he maybe will get a rose if when we're praying a novena. But what does that even mean?
Exactly.
Can we properly interpret that? And so then is the need to spend time in prayer, to consult, good friends or spiritual director.
Exactly.
To make sure that what you're asking for or what you're looking to do is in line with Scripture and tradition and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that the example of St. Francis that John of the Cross uses is he actually received a revelation from God. This was not, his imagination. This was a real revelation from God. He's a holy man, and he misinterpreted it. And also, I think what can be really dangerous is, what if you're praying for a sign that I will quit my job and move to California? I think you should take into consideration a lot of other things, not just a sign. What's the job market? How is it going to affect your family? I think a lot of common sense. So I think you need to be very, very careful, because sometimes when we make these prayers, is it a prayer of desperation?
Right. Yeah, and so I think for Thérèse, the way to see this would be, it's okay to ask things from God.
Exactly.
And then have complete confidence that whatever He gives us is what's best for us. And
that's right.
Is a gift from Him.
Yeah.
And just to trust that. I don't know if you could finish, maybe to end, like, what would you say, like, what would this maybe look like practically? Like, so we don't want to approach this in a superstitious way.
Yeah.
How might one pray, for a rose, or pray a novena to Thérèse in a way that's not superstitious?
Well, I would say any prayer or any novena, before you begin, simply say, God, this is what I want, but whatever you will give or not give, I'm going to accept it according to your will. I mean, that's the bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
And
maybe have a healthy level of self-doubt too, of like,
oh, definitely.
Even if I do get this loud booming voice telling me to do X or Y, that maybe I am mistaken. Maybe I don't fully understand what's going on here, because it's supernatural and it's beyond me.
Yeah.
Well, very good. I think this was a good episode, because, again, a lot of this was coming from my own history and my own struggles with Thérèse, which I continue to struggle with Thérèse in some ways.
We all
some
do,
of her flowery language, some of her the sentimentality of her spirituality, some things seeming superstitious. So I think it's helpful to talk through those, especially when we hear about Thérèse so much, and
Yeah.
people seem to love her. I think those of us who struggle with her maybe feel alone at times in that.
Yeah, yeah.
But there are other people out there who feel the same way too. So
Yeah, and we should love Thérèse for the right reasons.
yeah.
That's the thing. That's what's really important. And I think Thérèse would want that. She would want us to be devoted to her, so that we can have a greater devotion to the will of God. That's kind of the bottom line.
Yes. Well, amen. Well, thank you very much, Father Mark. Appreciate
welcome.
the conversation.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you for joining us this season. And be on the lookout. Make sure you've subscribed to our channel. That way you'll see when we release a new season in the coming months. God bless you.